Welcome to Glen Talks. I'm your host, Serena Hanschke, where we talk the world of all things business. Today, we're going to welcome Ian Campbell to Glen Talks. Today, we're honored to hear his journey as an expert negotiator and Hereditary Chief of Squamish Nation while looking to the future of indigenous communities. Ian, you have a vast amount of knowledge of these lands. Can you share a little bit about your life and career, how it's progressed, and to lead to where you are in your current role today?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and to share more stories. I think, my journey has been blessed, really with great mentors in my life that have inspired me. Many of my elders who are now passed on really embedded a deep sense of responsibility right from my childhood to present time. I really want to honor, every day as a blessing, and we can't take it for granted that we have tomorrow. So we want to do the best we can with the tools we have and always strive for gratitude and appreciation for all things in life. So, I'm from the Squamish Nation. I'm half Musqueam as well on my father's side. And growing up in the North Shore, I was mostly raised by my grandparents. So June and Lawrence Baker, my grandfather was a hereditary chief, and he was a survivor of residential schools, but he held on to our language and our culture. And he was raised by his grandmother, Tsialia, who taught him a lot of our old ways, that connection back to the early 1800s when this part of the world was first sort of being transformed with the arrival of European settlers. So I feel like that continuity of tradition has given me a lot of inspiration to draw from our rich history that spans thousands of years and apply it in a modern context. And throughout all of our stories, a common theme is transformation, as well as a trickster. The trickster is alive and well and omnipresent. The trickster is within each of us. And as a negotiator, it's important to look at these dynamics to try and find balance in our canoe in how we're moving forward.
Childhood, what kind of propelled you into a leadership role? At what point did you decide in your career that you're going to step up for your nation, and where did you find your passion?
Well, again, I felt really fortunate to be raised by my elders, who immersed us in our language and culture and ceremony. So from a young age, I was traveling to longhouses around the Salish Sea, where we seen other Coast Salish peoples practicing our tradition, our spirituality. I was always going out on the land, going hunting and fishing and camping and mountaineering. So being out in our territory, my grandfather would always teach us the stories of the mountains and of the village sites and the places. And as I became an adolescent, I realized how fortunate I was, because I always thought all my peers were learning this, that it was matter of fact and that everyone had access to this information. But as a youth in high school, I realized I really have access to something that's very special. So that really was kind of that catalyst for me to then really get involved in the language and culture and traditional drumming and singing, learning our Squamish Nation, the Squamish language and the mythology. And then from there, I started traveling. So when I graduated from high school, I got accepted into heavy duty mechanics and welding, which, I loved welding. I'm an artist, so I felt like it was just another part of my ability to produce good quality work. But instead, I got offered an all-expense youth exchange to Chile to live amongst the Mapuche. And I thought, go to school, pull wrenches, all-expense trip to South America. It wasn't a hard sell. I took off, and 2 months in Chile, it was in 92. It was right after the Pinochet dictatorship, still heavily militarized, a lot of blatant oppression of the Mapuche people. And that experience really showed me the human versus human, that it's not so different here in Canada. Oppression is oppression, marginalization, alienation, confiscation of lands and resources from our peoples is not much different than the dynamics in South America. It's just what degree of the spectrum of colonialism or imposition or usurping do we want to look at, which lens. So that really brought me home to then shift gears, I started working a lot with youth to immerse them in the language and culture and create camps and programs for our young people, which I did for many years in the public school system, child and family services, but then got recruited into politics by one of my mentors, Chief Gibby Jacob, who brought me in '99 to work with the nation in intergovernmental relations.
Yeah, I've heard you say in the past that you're a recovering politician.
Yes. Oh, it's great to be a civilian again. I spent 23 years in politics, 16 years as an elected councilor, 23 years as one of our lead negotiators. I'm a hereditary chief, so it's nice to not run for re-election a couple of years ago, the last term, and to fully resign after 23 years. I feel good that I created space, I accepted the baton, and ultimately passed that on to the next cohort to continue moving us forward.
So in terms of like mentorship, so you've been mentored by a lot of elders in that growing up. Where do you see your role now as you're kind of taking a step back, and where are you pushing those efforts right now?
Yeah, so I've certainly seen a lot of political leaders in my life and in First Nations communities across Canada. When I was growing up, I was very inspired by Joe Gosnell was one of the Nisga'a leaders, or Joe Calder and James Gosnell were some of the only politicians that I seen speaking publicly about rights and title. I seen our chief, the late Chief Joe Mathias, speaking. I was recruited by Ovid Mercurdy, who was the national chief at the Assembly of First Nations as a youth. He brought me all over Canada, all over Europe. So I seen a lot of political leaders, and I also seen a lot of cultural leaders. As a youth, I seen Robert Davidson on TV singing and carving. I had my own cultural mentors in my life, but I didn't see a lot of business leaders. It wasn't until I started my undergrad at UBC where I met Dave Tuckeroo and others that were really involved in entrepreneurialism. So as I leave politics, I feel good in the 20 years that I was a part of teams, because I can't take credit. It's really generations of effort to get here. I simply stepped in at a time that was fortunate to bring some of these projects to fruition. But my anxiety as a negotiator was always, so we're creating space, but who's going to occupy the field? Whether it was in forestry or hydro or ski hill development or land development, industrial projects. If we don't do it, we're going to outsource it. And the nation will benefit. Certainly there'll be assets and revenues and opportunities, but I want to maximize the value. So after seeing political leaders and cultural leaders, I now want to see business leaders. And we're seeing that curve now, that pendulum in Canada with a number of nations that are doing well. You see the Member 2 First Nations on the East Coast. You see the Osoyoos up in the interior here in the Okanagan. To name a couple, there's certainly Tsuut'ina in Calgary. There's many that come to mind that are doing well, including Squamish. So now that we've created space, I want to demonstrate to our youth and to our young people that they are reflected. They see themselves in those projects and get involved in the procurement, the contracting, the partnerships. That's my next effort.
So, and the history that your people have faced with a lot of hardship and having trouble with having accessibility to funds for projects and building that. So like you're seeing now that you're just starting to get some business leaders. Can you share a little bit about the past and why there was such hardship?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been fortunate. I've traveled to well over 40 countries now, and seeing human versus human all over the world. Again, it brings me back to the trickster is alive and well. So when I look at our particular story here on the West Coast, contact with European cultures was fairly recent. It was 1791 with Narvaez, the Spaniard, wandering into our waters, followed by Vancouver in 1792. This is fairly recent compared to Eastern Canada, who interfaced with European settlers as early as 1605. So by the late 1700s, we see the first kind of arrival of Europeans. By 1827, you see Fort Langley on the Fraser River here. If you read the Fort Langley journals, you'll see hundreds of Squamish canoes at any given time, along with other Salish relatives being present on the Stotlow, on the Fraser River. That was the mainstay of the economy burgeoning here in British Columbia. If you look at that trajectory by the 1860s, we're seeing preemption of our lands by settlers buying huge swaths of our lands without our consent, without compensation, paying Britain as a colony of Britain. So this starts to challenge the jurisdiction, the authority, and the governance of our peoples within our lands, where these are unceded territories. We don't have treaties. By 1872, you see BC joining Canada under Confederation, which is a deliberate attempt to usurp power from Indigenous peoples and allocate full jurisdiction to the provincial and federal governments. This is exacerbated by 1876 with the Indian Act, which is still alive and well in this country today. So under the Indian Act, this created the reservation system. So Squamish reserves comprise 0.3% of our territory, which means 99.97% of our lands and resources was confiscated from us. Under the Indian Act, they also imposed the residential schools. I'm the first generation out of residential schools in my family, and it's hard to call them schools because they're really internment camps. They weren't conducive for academia or creating affluence. It was under the guise of assimilation, which I think is very misleading, because if it was truly assimilation, we'd be fully integrated into every aspect of society. It was really meant to eradicate our language and culture and marginalize our people. But because of my grandparents and my parents who survived this era, we're now seeing a change, a shift into reconciliation. But under the Indian Act, we couldn't own private land, fee simple land. So while other Canadians have been buying and developing and flipping lands, creating substantive generational wealth, Indigenous peoples were completely shut out of that ability, even though it's all our land. So it was very definitely blatantly racist, the systemic racism. We weren't allowed to go to university up to my parents' era. So I'm the first MBA in my family. My brother's the first lawyer. My other brother's the first Red Seal electrician, for the simple fact that our parents weren't allowed. We weren't allowed to hire lawyers. So while our lands were being confiscated, we had no legal recourse to challenge the legitimacy of the Crown in their actions and their hostility towards Indigenous peoples here in Canada. I think Canadians have been very complacent on these matters because it suits the quality of life for Canadians to act as though this is a free and vacant land, free for the taking, free enterprise, a land of bounty, and Indigenous peoples are kind of out of sight, out of mind. Canada often fares in the top 10 in quality of life in the global index, and Indigenous peoples are often around 64. So there's still a huge distortion of wealth creation, wealth management, as well as quality of life. And that's not accidental. It's by design under colonialism that has pitted Indigenous peoples more or less into abject poverty. So it's really by design that we're really confronting Canada and their racist sort of policies that have really founded this country.
And you've done a lot of advocacy as well. I think recently you were advocating, I don't know how long ago that was, but for the renaming or the rolling back the naming of Stanley Park to what it is historically called. So can you share a little bit about that journey?
Yeah. So we were involved in some festivities that were occurring in Stanley Park for a number of years, where we brought in a number of our elders back then. And it was really some of our elders' ideas to say, hey, we're in our village here of Huai. Why is it called Lumberman's Arch? Like, what is this erasure? We should try and advocate to celebrate that this part of the world is laden with history and mythology that spans millennia. So that's where I really brought it forward with the renewal of the park lease for another 99 years. We wanted to try and balance our canoe again by saying to Heritage Canada, look, if you're going to renew this for 99 years, don't make us invisible in our own land. Celebrate that our history is your history, that it spans thousands of years. So we said, let's do a dual naming of Huai / Stanley Park. Unfortunately, Stockwell Day was the particular guy at the helm at that time who wouldn't entertain it or have anything to do with us. So I felt it was a real missed opportunity to really try to actualize tangible ways of affecting positive change. But we ended up moving on with the signage along the Sea to Sky Highway and other areas to create visible presence leading up to the 2010 Winter Olympics. We wanted to show it's not French, it's not English, therefore it must be Indigenous. We ultimately led people to the Cultural Center in Whistler, where they can then interface with some of our community members, our cultural ambassadors, and learn more about the richness of the history of this part of the world.
Thank you. Do you think it's worthwhile to come back and circle back to try and see what you can do to help change that? Because I mean, there's Stockwell Day. I mean, I do recall the guy, but it is a few years now, and there's been so much more advancement and attention towards what it means to have, you know, reconciliation both on an economic level and like to actually truly embody it. So you know, having supportive government is a huge step. But how would you like to see, like, if you were to do that exact same campaign today? I think it would probably be done, right?
Well, one would hope. I mean, I remain optimistic for sure that everything is incremental. And, you know, my motto is always resistance is futile. We are going to continue to push to not impose or put a gun to someone's head and say, you must respect Indigenous history and culture. We're really offering this. And it's something that has value. It really builds on our identity of who and what we are as Canadians. You know, if you read A Fair Country by John Ralston Saul, you know, he argues that Canadians are a bit in denial of their own true identity, that this country is not founded on French and English, it's founded on Indigenous peoples who are still here. So rather than perpetuating erasure, it's important to embrace the vastness of history that spans innumerable generations. So I think there's always opportunity to keep reintroducing those concepts as real tangible examples of reconciliation. You know, Stanley Park is globally renowned and associated with Vancouver, iconic with Vancouver. But again, our peoples are invisible in that narrative. So I think that's a disservice to all of us as Canadians to continue to perpetuate that when we can do better.
Yeah, and even the founding countries of Canada being France and England, but you guys are completely left out. Right. Can you share a little bit about your role as chairman of the Governance Council and your perspective of the strength and economic independence emerging with Indigenous communities?
Yeah, absolutely. So after leaving politics, I gravitated to Stuart Muir and Resource Works to look at the work that Stuart has been championing around partnerships and showcasing success. We can shoot holes all day long through what's not working, but I would rather point out tangible examples of what is working and really remove the ambiguity for Canadians on why economic reconciliation matters. So Stuart invited me to chair the Governance Council for the Indigenous Partnership Success Showcase, which we then do a conference at the Convention Centre every year in Vancouver. This year it'll be June 5th and 6th, where we're inviting people from across Canada as well as international audiences to look at what true partnerships look like, to create stability and certainty on projects, to bring benefits back to community members through an array of benefits that you know, really help families through careers and training and education, contract and procurement. It really then builds on UNDRIP, which is United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and a component of that UNDRIP is FPIC, which is free, prior, informed consent. So removing the ambiguity on consent through partnerships is really one way to create certainty for our economy moving forward in this country. Here in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, we recognize the value of our lands in a global context. The ability to get product to Tidewater and access global markets has to pass through our lands. So for years, when we didn't have legal recourse, we were completely shut out of those sectors. That era has come and gone, and it's time for us to mature as a society and embrace that we're in this together. So I think the IPSS it's an excellent time to bring people together and showcase. It's not goodwill or charity that Indigenous peoples are asking for. It's true partnerships. So I think that's something that we're going to see more of. I feel like we're just at the curve of that right now.
Mm-hmm. So thanks for your work. There's so much opportunity for economic development right now. With IPSS and other things like the FNMPC and NABOC and all of these other types of conferences, it just provides people an opportunity, I think, to learn a lot, but then also have that opportunity to engage. So when it comes down to partnerships, what does Squamish Nation look for?
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned the other entities, because we definitely want to support each other to create that critical mass of awareness. And we're seeing it's certainly not a one size fits all across this great country of ours. It's really looking at what is working for people, and let's share those stories. So for Squamish, a lot of our success when I first came in 99, back in the 1900s, it was really about land use planning. It was really about looking at sort of that 30,000 foot, that macro level of let's take inventory of our territory. How much of it has been privatized and developed? What is remaining? What are our values and principles? And how do we want to see our lands being utilized into the foreseeable future? So we did protect 50,000 hectares, which was 8% of our territory, as which is very hard to translate into English. So we came up with conservancies as a way of creating a regulatory regime. Then we got into forestry acquisition. We got into 9 clean energy projects. We did sort of the highway to create sort of value, front, mid, and back country. We got into sort of the Whistler Blackcomb renewal of their lease. Then the wood fiber LNG export facility were all steps that were progressive from our land use planning. So by creating that sort of vision, we're able to then signal to the world that we're open for business as long as it meets our metrics, our values, and our principles. We're not going to engage in business just for the sake of business. It has to be projects that meet our environmental conditions, meet our social needs, our economic prosperity, and good governance, where the nation is in a driver's seat as another level of government. So those basic pillars allowed us to then really look to our neighboring nations as well, to start to create protocol agreements with Musqueam, with Tsleil-Waututh, Lillooet to the north, to then come together. Instead of being in competition over scarcity of resources, we wanted to reframe those relations with our neighboring tribes and reaffirm our kinship ties. So once we were able to sort of throw our status cards out the window, we came together as more of a consortium who were then able to go and negotiate proper agreements with the provincial and federal governments to then attract investment and attract partnerships to manage and oversee kind of the volume and magnitude of projects within our territories.
And the Coast Salish people, they also are south of the border as well. Do you guys have any dialogue that goes back and forth when it comes down to some of these projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, not necessarily economic at this time, but we have maintained very strong ties to the Coast Salish in the U.S. side. So Coast Salish are a large kind of linguistic family that are dissected in half by the Canada-U.S. border. So we have a lot of relatives all through Puget Sound, all the way down to Oregon, as well as Vancouver Island, from Victoria to Campbell River, back to the mainland and back to the lower mainland. So it's a big geographic area in proximity to North America. We're a very large kind of linguistic family. We have maintained cultural ties throughout kind of our colonial experience. We do tribal journeys every year where we host each other, and there's a lot of interfacing culturally and spiritually. Politically, we support each other on a number of fronts, even as interveners in some of the court cases. So when we were challenging Trans Mountain with some of the grave concerns we had with that project, we participated in the NEB process, and we had tribes from the U.S. come and support Squamish Nation's concerns around extirpation of orcas, for example. How do you clean up an oil spill? Things like this. So we did a lot of collaboration between EPA on the U.S. and Environment Canada and a number of our tribes around the Coast Salish gathering. But we need to monetize this, similar to how Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh have gone beyond kind of showcasing to the world we're not a vanished race during the Olympics. We then had to monetize it through projects. And that's kind of the next iteration that I see as a lot more economic opportunities for us to invest in each other and support each other.
And you guys have a big project that I think is just starting to gain a little bit of traction now, the long-awaited wood fiber LNG project. So I'm sure you've been involved with a big degree to that over the years. And so how does it feel seeing that project come to fruition? And how is that project different on the landscape from, say, Trans Mountain, from having to deal with the dialogue and getting that project to fruition?
Yeah, excellent question. So our experience with Trans Mountain really wasn't so much about the product, it was about the process. Going through the National Energy Board, I was one of the representatives for Squamish as an intervener through that process. And every one of our concerns we felt were really just ticking boxes. The government really didn't do any further analysis or take into consideration increased shipping, a number of questions we had, why this location? So we were completely dismayed with the procedural fairness through the NEB, which only led us to oppose the project. Concurrently, we were then looking at LNG as an export facility in one of our former village sites known as Swayot. And we said, we're not just going to go cap in hand to some other level of government saying, please consider our interests. When it came to wood fiber, we really wanted to meet with the proponents and build a relationship. So over the first year and a half, it was really about why should we engage in this? Why should we entertain kind of the pen stock and the cooling facility and shipping? We didn't want to approach it similar to our experience in other EA processes. So the Squamish really then developed our own environmental assessment process, independent EA process, which yielded 25 legally binding conditions to the proponent that said, if you meet our conditions, we will then talk about an economic impact benefit agreement that then really garners consent. So this was really the first time, to our knowledge, that a nation in Canada had produced a legally binding set of conditions, which affected design changes. For example, we moved the project from seawater cooling, which would have drew millions of gallons of seawater from Howe Sound, heated it and chlorinated it and put it back into the sound. We were concerned about herring biomass and salmon rearing and other environmental concerns. So we moved them to air cooling. We electrified the process. We moved them away from the Squamish River estuary and any impacts through directional drilling to avoid the estuary. We've removed compressor stations from proximity to our inhabited reserves to more of the backcountry. A lot of our members had anxiety around explosion, even though probability is low, consequence is high. So we wanted to mitigate that. So there's a number of conditions that we introduced to the project to allow them to look at the feasibility and the viability of that, to then ultimately side with the nation in our process. So this was the first time that a nation has also been put into position as a regulator on the project through the life of the project. So that collaborative kind of model of how to work then with other agencies through management planning, through emergency response, as well as the economic opportunities throughout the life of the project, really made it quite a special and unique example of economic reconciliation in Canada.
So for your youth on these projects, do you find, I've heard in past on some of the other major projects that the proponents or the prime contractors, they promise jobs and they promise career paths, but oftentimes a lot of these, the jobs that are given are in a state where there isn't very much career progression that's allowed. Have you seen a change in that in some of the different public projects that are going on now? And will you see that on the wood fiber project as well?
Yeah, that's definitely my aspiration, is to see a lot more metrics of success in the next 10, 15 years when it comes to retention and training and careers, especially around entrepreneurialism. I really want to see a lot of our folks get involved in the value chains. And as I mentioned earlier, that was a big part of my anxiety as a negotiator, was we're creating space, who's going to occupy the field? So we've seen different iterations of this so far that concern me to a large part of the things you just cited. So, on wood fiber, we're seeing a lot more procurement opportunities where we looked at buckets. We looked at sole sourcing. We looked at preferred bidding and competitive bidding. We also then, because of all of these projects, it necessitated the need for the nation to structure accordingly. So a big part of my push was getting our development corporation established. So Inchkite DevCorp was really meant to limit liability back to the nation, to remove sort of political interference from our elected body on the day-to-day operations, and really resource the DevCorp with C-suite and the best and brightest to then oversee the volume and magnitude of projects. Part of the DevCorp was then to create a business registry where we would then vet and greenlight and endorse businesses that met our values that we can then provide to any project, be it SNOC or wood fiber or MST lands, to then allow for our businesses to flourish within those spaces so that it isn't just the nation benefiting, it's also the members within the nation that have a path to success. That's early in its iterations, acting as startups and retention and sort of the policy development and kind of the fiscal relations. These are all things that are kind of being ironed out. But I always believe it's storming, norming, and performing. So you begin with the storming process. Mm-hmm. You hope you're going to start normalizing. It's an ongoing concern until you start performing. So it's really that 1, 3, and 5 year that you have to look at. Where do we see ourselves and why does this matter? So the vision, the ultimate end goal is creating success for our people.
So you might have already answered this question, but what efforts are underway to build economic capacity and entrepreneurship within your community? Are there any specific projects that you have on the go or initiatives?
Well, when we're in the driver's seat on a project like SNOC, this is in False Creek, so it's 10.68 acres of development. These lands were taken from us in 1913. Again, no legal recourse. So post 1960, when we can finally hire lawyers, we became very litigious. So by 1977, we launched court action. We finally settled in 2003 with the reclamation of just under 11 acres in False Creek and a settlement of $92 million, which is a pittance of the value of the lands. This represented 6 different lands, not just False Creek. But nonetheless, we then reclaim some of our lands. We go through the process of RFPing through Ernst & Young. We then select a development partner. It's not our core competency at this time to then see a project through. So unfortunately, we have to bring in sort of equity partners at this time. Really within that space, I've always been pushing for contract and procurement opportunities for members. We have a number of small businesses within the nation who are doing really well around security and catering and earthworks, and we're now seeing electrical, we're seeing plumbing, we're seeing trades, we're seeing a lot more sort of business development. We have our trade center down in North Vancouver, which partnered with Kwantlen Polytech, and we're pushing people through these schools where they're being quite successful. What I hope to see from that is a lot more business, community growing. So, we're seeing groups like National Aboriginal Capital Corp, Tala Out, where entrepreneurs can get loans or grants for startups and they can get plugged in. The green lighting and the vetting of these businesses to plug them into projects, though, still a bit of a disconnect. So I know we're actively ironing that out from many different angles, and I think those things will start performing in the coming years.
So it's such an exciting time. What does the future look like for your nation, and how are we moving this dial on reconciliation, meaningful reconciliation?
Yeah, I think the future is bright. We still hunt and fish and go out on our land and do a lot of really fun and cool stuff in this part of the world. But we're not assimilated people. We simply adapt. As a hunter, I use my 7mm Magnum. I don't use a bow and arrow anymore, but it doesn't make me any less Squamish because I utilize a modern tool. So I think it's this continuity continuity of tradition that's exciting. When I look at the work of Dr. Stephen Cornell out of Harvard, he did 30 years of analysis of Indigenous groups in North America. Those that are successful are those that adhere to their values. They're not just assimilated to do whatever. And to me, that really resonated with me, of purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? It really has to be a path for young people. So, our demographics are like most Indigenous across Canada, about 60% youth. I'm a father, I have little ones, and I really want to create that path for them where they're going to have greater tools and accessibility than I did or my parents or my grandparents did. So it's that constant improvement that I think these projects represent, not only for Squamish Nation, because we're only 4,000 members in a sea of 7.5 billion people in the world. It's really what we're also doing to do our part in this region and in this country, and as Indigenous peoples globally. We maintain a lot of connections with other Indigenous peoples around the world, Maoris, for example, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we watch what they're up to down there, and it's a small world. We can go anywhere in a matter of hours now, and seeing what each other is doing is cool. So I think in that sense, I remain optimistic. There's always going to be conflict. We'll always get feedback, no matter what. 1/3 will agree with it, 1/3 will disagree, 1/3 will be complacent, but it can't stop us from achieving our goals and our objectives.
To keep an eye on where that accountability lies, just on having progress for the sake of progress, to ensure that there's proper stewardship. So thank you so much for all of the for all of the fight for all of your people that they've done. Because you can only think about what a possible future would look like if it was completely unencumbered for what could happen. So thank you. We have a fun section. We've got a quick rapid fire section. So it's questions in under like one word to one sentence. Okay. I'm going to throw some fun ones at you. So morning person or night owl?
Now that I'm a dad, morning person.
Favorite traditional dish from your community?
The nose of a spring salmon.
Sockeye or halibut?
Oh, man. I'm going to say halibut because I ate a ton of sockeye growing up.
Okay, fair enough. Best fishing spot around Squamish?
Secret. I can't tell.
Role model who has influenced your leadership style?
Ovid Mercredi.
Okay. Most rewarding aspect of being hereditary chief?
Being called Your Excellency. No, I'm just kidding. Being of service.
What's one way you stay connected with your cultural roots on a daily basis?
Drumming and singing.
One word to describe the essence of Indigenous Partnership Success Showcase. Other than it being hard to say.
Awesomeness.
Awesome. Your go-to method for maintaining focus during busy days?
Our mountains.
Yeah. Oh, just looking at them just gives you so much peace. What is your astrological sign?
I'm a Gemini.
Okay. And we can cut this part out, but Wikipedia needs an update. Born in 1974 and 1975. Put it in brackets.
That's hilarious. Honestly, 73.
Oh. Okay, we won't update it.
Yeah, right. Eh? That's cute.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down. We do have a gift for you that is fully branded with your name. So as you sit at your desk, you can never forget who you are.
Amazing.
Yeah.
That looks amazing. Thank you so much.
Got some nice Tim Tams in there from Australia. So.
Oh, fantastic.
I think they're Australian.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah,
I'm super happy to be here, and excellent interview. This was all a lot of fun. So
thanks. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
That's it for the show today. Thanks again for joining us, Ian. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care. That's our show for today. If you like the content that you see, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Share it with your friends and colleagues. We're going to continue to bring you inclusive insights and exclusive experiences. See you next time.